Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm Conor Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our History of Israel series. Today's video we're going to be looking at the period from 1967 to 1994. So if you like what you've seen already, don't forget obviously to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you're notified, and also don't forget to check out our many other videos on many different topics. I promise that you will not be disappointed, and if you share them with people, you will make many more friends to come. So with all that being said, we're going to dive straight now into the history of this period, so buckle up and let's go for the ride. Now where we left off in the last video was in 1967 with the Six-Day War. Now for the sake of this video, we're not going to go through all that because we've already covered that in a recent video, so I highly recommend that you check that out. But for this video, we're going to focus more on the aftermath of the Six-Day War. So first of all, with regard to Israel, as we said in that video, it needed strategic depth. And so that's what they got in the space of these 6 days. So within these 6 days, they managed to extend their strategic depth by 300 kilometers in the south, 60 kilometers to the east, and 20 kilometers to the north, as well as the fact that they increased their total territory by a factor of almost 4. However, this came at the cost of acquiring almost 1 million extra hostile Arabs. So the question was, what to do with them and how to achieve a lasting peace. So the Israelis, in response to this, they set up a military government, and this basically had control over the occupied territories, and this was in accordance to the 4th Geneva Convention. However, East Jerusalem was an exception to this. And the reason for this is because Israel completely annexed the territory for itself. Now, I actually happen to have a kippah here, which was given to me when I visited the Western Wall in 2014. And the reason I went to Israel/Palestine was because I wanted to see for myself both sides of the argument. I wanted to speak to Israelis and to Palestinians and to see the land and see the people for myself, rather than just either reading it in a history book or else just looking at different media outlets, which are obviously going to have their own biases. Now, the reason why I mention all this is because 1967 was a pivotal year for the city of Jerusalem, and that's because for the first time in 19 years, it was now open to people of all faiths. Why was this? Because when the Jordanians had control over West Bank, they actually banned all Israeli citizens, be they Jew or Arab, from entering there to go to any of the holy sites, with the only exception being Christians being allowed to visit the town of Bethlehem. So this meant that the Western Wall and all the other religious sites here within Jerusalem were off limits to any Israeli citizens. But in 1967, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, he visited the Western Wall, and he himself began to dismantle the road sign which the Jordanians had placed there, and now it was open, and the whole city was open, and the whole of the West Bank was open for people of all faiths to go and visit their holy sites. However, this came at the cost of the so-called Moroccan Quarter. So this is a very historic part of the old city of Jerusalem. However, this ended up being completely demolished by the Israeli authorities, and this was the reason why there is a plaza there now in front of the Western Wall. So this was an area which had predominantly Muslim Arabs that were living there, and yeah, they obviously were very annoyed at this. So anyway, you'd expect after the Six-Day War, you expect all the Arab states surrounding Israel to basically be like, okay, we got beaten, we accept that you guys win, we accept that you guys exist, let's just make peace and let's just end this, right? Wrong. That did not happen, because in August 1967, you had the famous Khartoum Resolution at the Arab League Summit of that year. And this is where they outlined the famous 3 no's. This is no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel. And then also within that year, this is where you had the famous UN Resolution 242, and this outlined that Israel, in order to achieve peace, had to do the so-called trade of land for peace. So this is where Israel ended up offering the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, and they offered the Golan Heights back to Syria. Although both sides are obviously, because of this Khartoum Resolution, completely rejected this, and as a result, they didn't end up getting those territories back. But while Israel was happy to offer the land to Egypt and to Syria, they were not happy to offer land to the Palestinians living in Gaza and West Bank. And the reason being is because Gaza had been controlled by Egypt and the West Bank had been controlled by Jordan, and they denied access and authority to both of these places, and also denied the existence of a Palestinian state. So this is part of the reason why it ended up being stalled, and the reason for this is twofold. First of all, to do with security concerns, because as we've just mentioned with regard to strategic depth, and then second of all, to do with the beginning of the settler movement. So this began in 1968, and obviously over the years it has continued to grow ever since, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just to let you know, this is part of the reason why peace negotiations kind of end up stalling. Now, in reaction to this, you end up having another aliyah, and this was mainly to do with the Arab world, but also to do with the Soviet bloc. So first of all, talk about the Arab world. Obviously, as a result of this, you had many people, in particular from Morocco and other places, who end up fleeing to Israel. So Morocco, as an example, throughout the 1960s, 130,000 Jews end up emigrating from Morocco to Israel. But on top of that, in the 1970s, you end up having 163,000 Jews migrating from the Soviet Union alone to Israel, never mind all the other places within the Eastern Bloc. And this was partly as a result of the fact that the Eastern Bloc within the Cold War had now decided that they were siding with the Arabs, whereas the West was now aligning themselves more with the state of Israel. So as a result of this, coupled with the latent anti-Semitism within the Eastern Bloc nations, this is why many Jews end up fleeing during this time. And then later in the 1980s, you end up having many Jews fleeing from Ethiopia as well. So there was another aliyah with regard to that. So during this time, from 1967 to 1994, Israel's population almost doubled. So it went from 2.78 million in 1967, and by 1994, it risen to 5.5 million. And this is partly as a result of all the different immigrants who have fled into Israel during this time from all around the world. So of course, Israel now controlling the West Bank and Gaza meant that they were now coming into conflict even more directly with many of the Palestinians. And so in response to this, the Palestinians started to launch many different attacks against Israel. So first of all, in 1970, you end up having skirmishes between the Palestinians and the Kingdom of Jordan. And this was an attempt by the Palestinians, because obviously you had many refugees there. There was an attempt by the PLO to overthrow the monarchy there. And so in response to this, the King of Jordan expelled the PLO from Jordan. And so this is where the center of focus of the PLO shifted from Jordan to southern Lebanon. And of course, this ended up being a contributing factor to the Lebanese civil war, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Then also with regard to the Palestinians, this is where they started to launch many different terror attacks against the Israelis. Most notably in the Munich Olympic Games of 1972, and this is where they captured 11 Israeli athletes and they held them hostage, and eventually they ended up killing them all. And then a few years later, you had Operation Entebbe in 1976. And this is where you had a plane load of people, so 106 Israeli citizens who were held hostage in Uganda by PLO terrorists. And then, of course, these people end up being freed by Mossad. And this is covered in the film Raid on Entebbe, so I highly recommend that you watch that film. So this kind of gives you an idea of this escalating tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians are responding to this by enacting acts of terror against Israeli citizens. But during this time, there's something which very fundamentally shifted. And what it is the view of the international left against Israel. And what I mean by this is more covered in our video on why people support Israel and Palestine, so definitely check that video out. But the long and the short of it with regard to this element here is that the international left, before 1967, was sympathetic towards Israel, because the left tends to support the underdog in any kind of situation. So before, Israel was weak, it was surrounded by Arab nations, and so it was seen that the Arabs, they were the ones who were the oppressors, and Israel were the oppressed. However, 1967 showed Israel to be strong, it had completely dominated its neighbours, and now it seemed that they were the ones who were the oppressors. And therefore, the shift of focus ended up going away from Israel and end up being more towards the Palestinians. So now they were seen as the victims, they were seen as the oppressed, and this is why public opinion in the West started to shift away from Israel and towards Palestine. So just to give you a little idea of that, just to explain why people's views on Israel today is seen as such a controversial topic in the West, this is the roots of it here. And then on top of that, you end up having the Yom Kippur War of 1973. So this is an attempt by Egypt and Syria to reverse the gains that Israel had made in 1967. They were obviously unsuccessful with regards to that, and Israel was able to push them back. However, this attack, which was pretty much a surprise attack, they didn't expect this at all, and it took place obviously on Yom Kippur, which is one of the holiest days in the calendar for the Jews. So this led to two reactions. First of all, America, which up to this point had kind of stayed out of the conflict, and as you can see on the graph here, they hadn't really got involved in the conflict up to this point. But afterwards, they started to really ramp up their military support for Israel, and this is within the context of the Cold War. So Israel had proved itself to be a reliable Western ally, and the Arabs had become more and more pro-Soviet. So this is why American aid really started to ramp up during this time in order to counterbalance the aid that the Soviets were giving to the Arab countries. And also within Israel itself, it led to a huge political shift. And this is where you end up seeing the Likud party, led by Prime Minister Begin, start to really take off. So in 1977, this is where the Likud party finally took over from the Labour Party, which had been dominant up to that period. And now they, who were pretty much a right-wing conservative nationalist party, they now were the ones who were in office, and they were the ones who were driving the policy. In particular, with the settlements, which the Labour Party had kind of tacitly supported beforehand, but the Likud party was very much in favour of it now. But in 1977, it wasn't just that Likud ended up coming to power in those elections. In 1977, something also happened that was just absolutely remarkable, and that is that Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt, who 4 years ago had gone to war against Israel, now, for the first time, he was coming and he wanted peace with Israel. And so what ended up beginning now was the Camp David Accords, and this is where Israel and Egypt agreed that the two states would recognize each other, the two states would have peace, and that over the period of the next 5 years, Israel in stages would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula and give all of the territory back to Egypt. So this is in accordance with the UN Resolution 242. So Israel was indeed trading land for peace. However, this did not come at no cost at all, because Egypt ended up being kicked out of the Arab League from 1979 to 1989 as a result of this, and also Anwar Sadat in 1981 ended up being assassinated as a result of this. So in my opinion, Anwar Sadat is one of the bravest politicians of the modern era, but still, even in spite of the tragedy, he took the very first steps in the long road towards peace. However, the same could not be said for Syria, same could not be said for Lebanon, nor could it be said for the Palestinians. And so reaction to this, Israel, first of all, annexed the Golan Heights in 1981, because they was like, right, if you're not going to sit and negotiate with us like the Egyptians did, you can forget about getting the Golan Heights back. And then with regard to the Palestinians, because of their continued intransigence, what Israel did under the Likud party is they ramped up the number of settlers. So by 1983, you end up having 100,000 Israeli settlers in Palestinian territories. Although it should be noted that 76,000 of these were actually in East Jerusalem, which, as we've said, was annexed by Israel. So it kind of counts, but doesn't really count as such. And then with regard to Lebanon, in 1982, Israel ended up invading them. Now, the Lebanese civil war is an incredibly complicated thing. It took me hours and hours to sift through all the information for this to see what was relevant for this video and what wasn't. But cut a long story short, what had happened as a result of the PLO being kicked out of Jordan is that, like we said, they moved their base of operation to southern Lebanon. And southern Lebanon, at the time, ended up being referred to informally as Fatah land. And this is because Fatah was the dominant faction within the PLO at the time. So, long story short, southern Lebanon was pretty much in the hands of the PLO, completely independent of control by Beirut. So in the early years of the civil war, there had been a few border skirmishes between Israel and the PLO who were operating out of southern Lebanon. But in June of 1982, Israel had had enough, and they decided that they were going to invade. So by late August 1982, the PLO leader, who was Yasser Arafat, he ended up having to flee from there, and he set up shop in Tunisia instead. However, just 15 days later, the Christian president of Lebanon, who was Bashir Gamal, he ended up being assassinated. Now, he was actually in the process of recognizing Israel and setting up a peace deal with the Israelis, but he obviously ended up being assassinated. And so in response to this, you're not having the Christian phalangists, yeah, so this was a faction within the civil war there. And what they did in retaliation is that they went to two Palestinian refugee camps, which was Sabra and Shatila, and they massacred between 460 and 3,500 Palestinian refugees. Now, there ended up being a lot of controversy with regard to this, partly because Israeli forces were actually very much near to these camps, and ended up being a debate about how much they were actually involved. And so this ended up sparking a huge amount of controversy and a huge amount of protest, not just in the Arab world, but actually within Israel itself. So this ended up seeing the largest ever protest in Israel's history, which took place in the city of Tel Aviv, and there were 400,000 Israelis who came out onto the streets to protest this massacre, which represented about 10% of Israel's population at the time. So, the largest ones in all of Israeli history to protest the killing of Palestinians. And what ended up happening as a result of this the year after is you end up having a public inquiry, and as a result of this, the defense minister, Ariel Sharon, was barred from ever holding that office again. Although we should mention that obviously he ended up becoming the prime minister a few years later, but either way, he wasn't barred from holding that office, but anyway. But in spite of all that, in spite of all the controversy and stuff, Israel decided that by 1985, they'd had enough of the Lebanese civil war. They pacified the Palestinians who were there enough, and so they end up withdrawing. However, during all this time with the Palestinians, they obviously had been occupied. So how were they feeling throughout this time? Well, in spite of the record economic growth which had taken place during that time, so just to give you an indication of this, as you can see on the screen now, in 1950, the GDP per capita for the Palestinians was $1,549. By 1967, which is the beginning of the year of Israeli occupation, it had risen to $2,852. And by 1984, which was again just 17 years afterwards, it had risen to $4,807. So as you can see, it's absolute record growth under Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza. And yet still, many of the Palestinians were obviously not happy with this. And so this caused, in 1987, the so-called First Intifada. So Intifada in Arabic means the shuddering or the shaking off. So this was seen as the shaking off of the Israeli occupation. And within the 6 years that it lasted from 1987 to 1993, there ended up being 200 Israelis who were killed from this, and almost 2,000 Palestinians who ended up getting killed as well. Although, what's complicated with regard to this is that of the 2,000 Palestinians that end up being killed, there's a huge debate as to how many of them were killed by Israelis and how many of them were killed by other Palestinians. So at the low end of it, there's 360 of them who were killed by other Palestinians, and on the high end, it's 1,000 of them. So potentially you could have had a situation where almost half of the people who end up being killed in this were killed by other Palestinians. And the reason for this is because many people were seen as informants for the IDF and the other Israeli intelligence services. So that explains why so many of them were being killed. But again, we will never fully figure out what the actual total figure is. But still, in spite of all this, in spite of all this terror, this led the Israelis and the Palestinians to, for the first time, start to come together. So in the Madrid conference of 1991, two things ended up happening. First of all, the UN ended up revoking the decision that was made in 1975, which had classed Zionism as a form of racism. But also within that conference, this was the very first time where you had Israeli delegates and Palestinian delegates being together in the same room to negotiate peace. And so 2 years later, the famous Oslo Accords ended up happening. So this is Oslo I. And this saw Israeli and Palestinian leaders come together and shake hands and start working out a path towards peace. So as a result of these talks, the Palestinian National Authority, or what would eventually become the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, they end up being set up, and this would establish self-governance and self-determination for the Palestinians living in Gaza and West Bank. So now, for the very first time, the Palestinians would be able to govern their own territories, and over time this would lead to Palestinian independence, provided that they made peace and recognised the state of Israel. So in 1994, there ended up being 3 Nobel Prizes that were handed out, and this was to the Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, the Israeli Foreign Minister Peres, and also to the head of the PLO, who was Yasser Arafat. So now it seemed that there was going to be peace, and then also within that year of 1994, Jordan ended up recognising Israel. So now, within this period that we spoke about from 1967 to 1994, a lot has changed. You've now gone from a situation whereby Israel's neighbours are trying to destroy it, and now we've gone to a situation whereby on its western border, Egypt has recognised her, and now on her eastern border, Jordan has recognised her. So there's now peace between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. However, the same could not be said for Lebanon, which obviously tried to recognise Israel and they end up assassinating their president. Syria, which even to this day has made no attempt at trying to make peace with Israel or to recognise her. And with regard to the Palestinians, let's just say there's a reason why I left it at 1994, because I could have gone up to the year 2000 as I had originally planned when I began the series, but I think that 1994 represents a real turning point where peace was on the cusp and then things went different, right? So that's what we're going to cover more in the next video. So if you like this video, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also check out our many other videos and also check out the other videos within this playlist if you've missed it so far. But yeah, so with that, we have to kind of end the video, and in the meantime, have a great day and bye.